A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start the day first with the prelims of the day. Today we'll be seeing geography, and in that we'll take up the topic of landforms. So different types of landforms and their various features could be asked and match the following, or you can also have say an example of a landform in the main question, and then in the options you may be given which type of the landform it is related to and what it actually means. So today we'll have a look at the different categories of landforms, like it's fluvial or glacial or desert or coastal, karst topography and all such kinds. And in each of these categories of landforms, you will have to list down the depositional and the erosional features separately. So if you have something like Zeugen or Yardings, and then in one of the options it is given that it is a depositional landforms, then it is one of the depositional landform. It becomes incorrect. So you have to clearly know what is the depositional one and which of them are erosional ones. And then you'll also have to know one line at least about each of them, that what it means, how is it formed, what is the shape of that landform. So these basics you'll have to know about these landforms. So this is the homework for today, and I also went through the other day's homework, whether it was on the application of the Choluteca Bridge story or was it on the type of inflation and the Peace to Prosperity plan. Many of you have come out so much enthusiastically in the comment section, and you have written great answers. So keep that effort going and keep filling the comment section more and more. So now we will start topics of the day. First topic is related to secularism, which can come as part of your GS paper too, because in polity, secularism is one of the basic features of our constitution. It can also be a part of our GS1 because secularism and communal harmony and all are parts of the Indian society as well. So now we know how this Ram Janmabhoomi, that the temple ceremony has now been conducted. So therefore you can face a question on secularism broadly. And most of the times what happens is when these kinds of sensitive questions are asked, it becomes very difficult to form an objective answer. And also we have been told that to restrict ourselves from writing completely against the government and all that. So taking an apolitical stand at the same time being objective is it's very critical in these kinds of questions, and is also very difficult. So you cannot show your inner emotions when you're answering these types of questions. So that makes it very difficult for handling these kinds of questions. So what we'll be seeing today is just a few things which you can make a part of your answer, so that your answer looks it looks that you have also addressed the question, but without being emotional about it. So the first thing we're going to look at is an important, what I found in this particular editorial, the groundbreaking. So in that these words I found were really important, which can be made a part of your answer. So now whatever has happened, it has to allow us to go to this transition from conciliation, from conquest we have to go to conciliation, and from diatribe you have to move towards dialogue, and from triumphalism, that one of the two communities or one of the two religions is going to win, from that phase we have to move towards tranquility. So this arrow is actually the other way. So we have to move from conquest to conciliation, from diatribe to dialogue, and from triumphalism to tranquility. So this can form a good part of your body of the answer, and also a good part of your introduction. You can as well frame your introduction based on these keywords, that this should be a new beginning, and we have to move from conquest to conciliation, diatribe to dialogue, and triumphalism to tranquility. So this can give you a very good conclusion for your answer. Also, this particular editorial says that we are moving from one particular end to a new beginning. So it says that the end is, this episode has put an end to the perceived humiliation that the Hindus have faced in the last several years. So there is an end to this kind of humiliation, and also there is an end to the strife that has happened between the two religious communities and lot of communal violence over it. So this end should also mark a new beginning in our relations. First, it should also it is going to mark an new beginning for political ascendancy of the Hindus, and secondly also it is going to mark a new beginning for fraternity among the religious community involved. So it is going to create more harmonious relations between the Hindus and Muslims, and this should be the new beginning of this episode. So this again is a more objective which can be incorporated as a part of your answer, that this is going to end humiliation and strife, and on the other hand it is going to mark a new beginning of political ascendancy and also religious harmony and fraternity between the Hindus and the Muslims, which is a new beginning. So this again is not very political, it's not emotional also, and this can give this can form a part of your answer. It will help you in keeping your views more balanced. But when you're asked to point out the issue, one important issue is the principled distance which was absent. So Indian breed of secularism talks about the principal distance as against the Western concept, where secularism means a complete separation between the state and the religion. But in India, principal distance means that the state is going to maintain a distance, an equal distance from all the religions, and is not going to interfere in their affairs. So this principled distance principle has been broken, and this line of separation between the state and the religion was also crossed. So it's not that when a question comes on this, you are not going to point out any issues. That is also not right. So you have to point out some issues. One of that can be the violation of this principal distance. And now let's see the conclusion. So writing the conclusion again is a very challenging and a tricky part in such questions. So you can say that we have to actually focus more on not just building the temple, not just building the Ram temple, but also by following the principles that were laid by Lord Ram. So Lord Ram was adhering to the principles of justice and fairness and empathy when he had his kingdom. So these were the values of Lord Ram which we need to incorporate in our society and lifestyle. So this is one important way to conclude. And the next is even genetic studies have shown how India has been a melting pot of populations and cultures in several centuries, thousands of centuries before. So this has always been a melting pot, and therefore it will continue to have that harmonious relations between various religious communities. And you can also write that end and beginning thing which I discussed in the beginning. So all these points can form an objective conclusion without being emotive about this issue. So now we'll go on to this topic, which is related to the role of startups. This is actually, of course, this is a part of your maybe GS3 syllabus under the economy and the role of startups in the Indian economy. So under this, we are just going to discuss a small example of the startups too, which you can use as an example whenever you are writing answer on these startups and what role they can play in the Indian economy. So this article was about a startup by name Jenny Sites. So this particular startup has been now incubated by NASSCOM also, and what the startup has done is it has developed an artificial intelligence powered business intelligence suite. So this intelligence suite is going to analyze the current business scenario of a particular enterprise, and is also going to calculate the future business trends for that particular enterprise. So this is particularly going to help the small and the medium enterprises in India. So this you can quote as an example whenever you're writing about startups, that the Genocides, it is also incubated by NASSCOM, and it has now come out with an artificial intelligence powered business intelligence suite, which is going to analyze the business scenario in the current and also going to predict the future business trends. So this is going to be helpful for our small and medium enterprises. And also today there was one more news related to the startups which was announced by the RBI. So there were also articles on the RBI, the policy rates, how the RBI has kept the policy rates unchanged. So in that article, one of the measures that the RBI has taken as part of this review was that even the startups have been included in the priority sector lending norms. So therefore the startups are also going to get better funds, easier funds from the banks, because now they have also been incorporated under the PSL norms. So whenever you are analyzing the steps taken by the government to promote startup ecosystem in India, you can quote this, that the RBI has recently it has announced that even the startups are going to be included in the priority sector norms, priority sector lending norms. So this was just about an example of the startup which you can incorporate in your answers on startups. So now we'll move to the next topic, which is related to financial system issues. So our banking system has been facing several issues. For instance, the twin balance sheet syndrome, the rising non-performing assets of the banks. So in order to help the banks to deal with these non-performing assets, particularly in the time of COVID, where these defaults and non-repayment of the loans could even increase because of the economic lockdown and the difficulty faced by various industries to run at normal pace. So their loans, whenever they have taken from banks, that repayment will also be suffered because of COVID. So what the RBI has done is, RBI has now set up an expert committee under the chairmanship of KV Kamath. So this expert committee is going to recommend on the norms on how these COVID related stress loans are have to be resolved. So now that the IBC, that is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, has now been kept under suspension, so this expert committee under the chairmanship of KV Kamath, that has been set up by RBI, is going to recommend norms on which the resolution of these COVID-19 stress loans are going to take place. So how these cases will be resolved, that will be recommended by this particular committee. So this can also become important from your prelims point of view. You may simply have a question matching the names of the committees with their purpose, or you can have a direct question like KV Kamath committee was set up for which of the following purposes. So you have to keep this in mind. Move on to the next one, which is related to India-Pakistan relations. This will India-Pakistan relations will come under your GS2 paper related to international relations. So the cartographic challenge which we saw last week on Friday was how Pakistan has released a new political map in which it is showing entire Jammu and Kashmir and also the Sar Creek and including Junagadh in Gujarat also to be part of Pakistan. So this has created a new border issue between India and Pakistan. Apart from this, one more issue that is has always been there between the two countries is the fishermen issue. So now we'll have a look at the fishermen issue between India and Pakistan and what can be the way forward. So why is it that there is a fishermen issue? Because the fish stock on the Indian side of the border has almost been depleted. So therefore the fishermen, they do not have any option but to take risk and move further and further in search of a better catch. So sometimes they inadvertently cross that maritime border and are caught by the Pakistan authorities. So this is the reason why this dispute is arising. So then what is usually done to these fishermen who have been caught by Pakistan? They are kept in jails in Pakistan. They are languishing in jails for several years. They do not even get consular access, nor do they have any information about their family, nor do the family members have any whereabouts there about the fishermen's health or anything. So therefore this has led to a kind of a humanitarian issue that is prevailing between India and Pakistan. So then what is the solution for this? So way back in 2008 itself, both India and Pakistan, they have come forward and they have formed what is called as a judicial committee. This judicial committee comprises of 4 retired judges from each country. So there will be 8 judges. So there will be 4 retired judges from each country, and these judges will be visiting the other country. And when they visit, they will visit these prisons where the fishermen have been held, and they will look into various matters like what about the consular access given to these fishermen, what is the response and what is the repatriation, what is the status of their repatriation, what is the health condition of these fishermen. So everything will be looked into by this judicial committee. So when this happened in 2008, this judicial committee recommended that all of these fishermen should be released. But however, both the governments, the Indian and the Pakistan government, did not implement the recommendation of the Judicial Committee, and later on it was not even set up again. So this was the, even when the solution was started, its recommendations were not implemented, and after which it was not even set up again. So this is the issue related to the solution. So what should be the way forward? First, we need to understand that this is a humanitarian issue, therefore our response should also be humanitarian. So these are the fishermen who are really under poverty, and they have to, in order to make their life, in order for their livelihood issue, they will have to venture out into the sea to catch fish. The next thing is, because it is a humanitarian issue, we can follow a policy of no arrest, because once it is verified that they are fishermen and they are not spies, then they need not be arrested. So we can follow this policy of no arrest, recognizing the fact that it's a humanitarian issue. So third is, whenever these fishermen are arrested, their boats are also taken by the Pakistan authorities. So what happens is, even when these fishermen are released, they do not have their boats to again venture out into the sea. So that is going to create a lot of difficulties for them. So at least we need to make it a point that the boats are also released along with the fishermen. So next step is that this judicial committee, which first came up in 2008 but was then discontinued, will also have to be revived, so that these fishermen get faster, quicker consular access, and also their health conditions are maintained properly in the other country, and there is also faster release of these fishermen from those jails. So this is related to the way forward and the fishermen issue between India and Pakistan. Now we move on to the next topic, which is related to the new education policy. This again is a part of your GS2 syllabus, and we have discussed a lot regarding the new education policy, what its features are, what are its merits, what is the importance, and also what are all the issues that the NEP policy has. So if you get a question in the exam that the NEP 2020, it aims to universalize education. So critically analyze, do you really think it is going to help universalizing the education? So in such an answer, you will have to come out with some arguments to show that it may lead to universalization or it may not. So in this, we are going to look at the critical points of it, that there are few issues in the NEP 2020 which may not lead to achieving this goal of universalization of education. So in that, the first argument is related to the education in the age group of 3 to 18 years. So it says that 3 to 6 years, the early childhood education is going to be focused upon. So this is said in the new education policy 2020. So but when we look at this 3 to 6 years age group, this education, preschool education, mostly happens in the Anganwadis. And these Anganwadis, they are not professionally trained as a teacher, and there are several flaws when it comes to the Anganwadi centers also, which are not completely equipped. The Anganwadi workers who get very low pays and are also not trained as teacher, will they really act to achieve this early childhood education for the 3 to 6 years? Is that going to be successful, is a big question. So this NEP is going to combine this 3 to 6 years plus grade 1 and grade 2. So that is total of 5 years. 3 years of early childhood education and then grade 1 and 2. So totally 5 years is going to be combined, and the aim of this is going to be foundational literacy and numeracy mission. So when this 3 to 6 years depends upon the quality of the Anganwadi workers, do we really think that this foundational literacy and numeracy mission is going to be successful? So this is one matter of concern, that the Anganwadi workers not being trained as teachers and the Anganwadi centers not being well equipped. So this foundational literacy and numeracy, is that going to really happen? Is one question. So this might directly affect the universalization of education. The second issue is the private participation. So to universalize education, apart from the public sector, even the private sector participation is definitely required. And this is precisely what the NEP 2020 also says. It says that education is a public service, but however, it also emphasizes on philanthropic private participation. But when we talk of private participation, there are two issues related to it. One is that the fees are very high, and two is that there has been such a huge mushrooming of the private sector educational institutions that the quality of education provided in these institutions have dropped to very low levels. So first we need to regulate the quality of the education in this private sector participation, because universalization of education also, it's very important that there is universalization of quality education. So therefore, even when private sector is encouraged, there are too many private players, and this has reduced the quality of education, and we need to regulate these private institutions so that those which are providing low quality education are weeded off. And the third the third issue related to the universalization is education complexes. The NEP 2020 comes out with this idea of setting up education complexes. But however, what Kothari committee had recommended, what it meant by education complexes was completely different from the education complex which is proposed by NEP. So what Kothari committee recommended was, there is going to be this a higher secondary school, and there will be many small neighborhood primary schools. So there is going to be a linkage between this. So all those children who study from these neighboring primary schools, the smaller neighborhood primary schools, they are going to go to this higher secondary school. So between these, there will be a collaborative synergy. So this is what Kothari committee meant by education complexes. But what the new education policy talks about by what it means by saying education complexes is, it is going to be a large complex, that is, it is going to be a larger institution. So each of the colleges is going to have more than 2,500 students, and also the policy talks about these colleges being economically viable. For it to be economically viable, these colleges need to be very big. So in which case, these small neighborhood primary schools may see closures. This also happened in Rajasthan, where 14,000 such public schools were closed because the number of students were less, and therefore the argument given for closing down the schools was that we need to consolidate the small schools because these small schools are suboptimal. So this is the issue with the educational complexes. If such smaller schools are closed down, again it will raise questions about the schools, the bigger schools being accessible to children. And once we talk of accessible to children, and if it becomes inaccessible to children, that will defeat the goal of universalization of education. And the next issue is the mother tongue issue. The NEP 2020 says that up to class 5 and if possible up to class 8, then instructions will have to be given in the mother tongue. This also has several issues. One is what is going to happen in the border areas. For example, in the case of Karnataka, if Kannada needs to be taught up till class 5 or class 8 if possible, then in the border areas with Maharashtra, Marathi is a dominant language. Then what if Kannada is going to be taught in these border areas? Then the children there whose dominant language is Marathi are not going to understand. This is directly going to affect their foundational literacy and numeracy. So what should be the medium of instruction in these border areas? If it is mother tongue, then that is directly going to affect the foundational and the numerical literacy of these students. And this is again directly going to impact the universalization of education. And also about the transfers. When the state government, education is under the state government, and when the state government transfers the teachers, for instance, if a teacher is transferred from Bangalore to some area in the border of Karnataka, Maharashtra, and from Bangalore if she goes there and she starts teaching in Kannada, but there the majority or the majority people speak Marathi and children also understand Marathi, then it is going to create difficulty for the teachers as well, that they will not be able to instruct the students in Marathi. So this is another hurdle that can come in the way of universalization of education. So, and that is also when the different language is not understandable by the children, it is going to affect their foundational literacy, which is directly going to impact the universal of education. So now we'll move on to the next topic, which is related to research and development. This is part of your GS3 syllabus related to science and technology. So we have seen multiple times how the research and development spending in India is low and it needs to be improved. In order to ensure this, in 2013, the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy came up, which promised to increase the spending in the research and development. But even after that, this has not really increased to the desirable extent. So now we'll see is an analysis of both positive and otherwise of the research and development status in India. So there is this report called as the Research and Development Statistics and Indicators 2019-20 report. This particular report is based on the National Science and Technology Survey that happened in 2018. So this report is based on the National Science and Tech Survey 2018, which was done by the Department of Science and Technology itself. So this report, therefore, the data is very authentic. So this report points to a very the positive trend that is happening in case of research and development. First, it says that the gross expenditure on research and development has tripled between 2008 and 2018. So the gross expenditure on research and development has tripled between 2008 and 18, but mostly this spending was driven by the government itself. So the private sector did not contribute to much of this increase. Rather, this increase in the expenditure was driven by the government itself. The second important thing that this report points out is the number of researchers per million population. This has also increased a lot in the previous decade. For instance, if you plot this graph of the number of researchers per million population in the year 2000, this was 110. And in the year 2015, this was 218. And in the case of 2017, the number of researchers per million population was 255. So therefore, there is an increase in the number of researchers per million population. The next important positive aspect that this report notes is that the women participation in the research and development project has also increased. So in 2000-2001, their participation was just 13%, whereas in 2016-17, their participation has increased to 24%. So this is another positive thing that is identified by this report. Then it talks about the GDP spending of the government, that India spends nearly 0.7% of its GDP on research and development in 2017-18. But however, if you look at a comparison of the GDP spending for the proportion of GDP spent on research and development by other countries, you will get a clear picture how less India's spending on research and development is. So if you compare with the BRICS countries, which are on the similar levels of development, Brazil is also spending 1.3% of GDP on R&D. China is spending 2.1% of GDP on R&D. And if you compare the world-renowned countries which are innovating on a large scale, so Israel is spending 4.3% on research and development, Korea is spending 4.2%, and US is also spending 2.8% on R&D. So looking at the statistics, it is very clear that India also needs to improve its research and development expenditure. So now there was a report titled Research and Development Expenditure Ecosystem. So this was a report that was prepared by the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. This particular report gave several recommendations which can be incorporated to improve the research and development in India. First recommendation was that the research and development spending in India should be commensurate with the economic growth. So it must be somewhere more than 2% of GDP itself. So this was the first recommendation. Second, it held that the line ministries at the center, they must be mandated to allocate a certain percentage of their budget to promote research and development in their own departments. So in the areas in which their departments are dealing with, a certain percentage of this budget should be allocated for research and development. The third recommendation it made was the private sector investment in the research and development needs to be increased. The current private sector investment was just 0.35% of the GDP. So this the private investment in the research and development has to be increased. And the fourth, it said that we need to set up research and development export hubs. The report specifically said that we need to create 30 dedicated research and development export hubs, and we have to have a corpus of nearly 5,000 crore which can be used to fund the major projects which could form a part of this export hub. So these were the important recommendations that were made by this committee to improve the research and development ecosystem in India. So this particular article in the newspaper regarding academic research, how academic research itself is not enough. We need to focus on post-academic research, which will actually lead to national development. So there was nothing in that article apart from this fact. So all of this report and all the data I have myself given, so there is nothing in that article as such. Now we'll go to the next topic, which is related to the banking issues again. So today itself we saw how because of the COVID crisis, several of the firms may be defaulting on the loan payments, and in order to find out the norms for resolving these stressed loans during COVID, RBI has set up a committee, an expert committee under the chairmanship of KV Kamath. So now we'll again be looking at several other banking issues which the banks are now currently facing. So among that, the first issue is the bank competition. So this particular point says that there were 97 banks in 1947 when India became independent, and today there are 95 scheduled commercial banks. So you can see that there is the number of banks has not increased, and therefore there is very less bank competition in India. So we say that the credit availability needs to be increased. The banks need to start lending more. So if this credit availability needs to increase, then we will have to this competition among the banks will need to be promoted. So there only when the competition is there between the banks, there will be this competition driven innovation. Only then they will come out with innovative credit packages. So in order to improve the credit availability, we need to ensure that there is competition among the banks. So this looking at this data, it shows how the banks per se have not grown, and there is no such thing as competition among the banks. This needs to improve. The second thing it talks about is a private bank governance. So in this it gives data that 30% of the deposits are with the private sector banks. But however, the private sector banks form 80% of the bank market capitalization. So, but however, what has happened is even when they have 30% deposits, but they form 80% of the bank market capitalization. What is happening is if they are not if their hands are not held by the government when they are in crisis, then the market is going to collapse. So in order to prevent, the government will have to handhold these private sector banks even when they are failing. So this has led to a tendency, what we call as privatizing the gains and socializing the loss. That is, whenever these banks undergo a failure, then the government will have to handhold them and infuse credit into these banks and prevent them from failure. So this government's money is nothing but the taxpayers' money. So whenever banks undergo any losses, it is the taxpayers' money which is going to recapitalize the banks. But however, when these private banks are performing well, the gains are going into the private hands and not to the hands of the people. So this private bank governance system has led to this tendency of privatizing the gains and socializing the loss. So this needs to change. So the private sector governance, the private bank governance needs to be made stronger so that this tendency doesn't happen. The next issue is the government bank governance. So this is about the public sector banks. We saw that 30% of the deposits are with the private banks. So 70% of the deposits are with the public sector banks. But however, they form just 20% of the market capitalization. So why this is happening? Even they have huge deposits, their market capitalization is very less. One reason for that is the irrational employee cost. The employee cost itself of these banks is too high. So for instance, the employee cost to market capitalization ratio of some of the banks are very huge. Canara Bank, for example, has a employee cost to market capitalization ratio of 77%. Similarly, Punjab and Sindh Bank has employee cost to market capitalization ratio of 155%. This shows how irrationally high the employment cost in these public sector banks are. So this calls for a stronger governance in the public sector banks as well. So this is the third issue. Next, we come to the fourth issue, which is related to RBI's regulation and supervision. So in the past, we have seen several scams in the banks. For example, recently the Punjab National Bank scam. So this has given rise to questions about what role the statutory auditors need to play, that there has to be ethical conduct, and also the banks will have to come out with very robust risk management system. So these are the issues that this will have to be worked at so as to make RBI's regulation and supervision more robust. So the PNB scam, it showed how the statutory auditors have failed, and also that the bank did not have a robust risk management system. This is where the role of RBI comes in. RBI is supposed to have regulated these private sector banks and ensured that they comply on all these respects. They comply on the fact that they have a robust risk management system. So this points to some of the loopholes in the RBI's regulation and supervision system. So this also needs to be made more stronger, that so that these banks, they ensure that they comply with all the norms laid down by the RBI. So this is another issue related to the banking system. Next is the non-bank regulatory space. So these non-banking finance companies are also large in number, and they have been providing credit to the MSMEs. So therefore, we know how important these non-bank space entirely, how important it is for the financial inclusion and also for these sustainability of this MSME sector. Therefore, we need to provide for more regulatory space and more supervision for the non-banking financial companies as well, because they are also now failing, as can be seen recently. So the non-banking regulatory space also needs to be strengthened because of the important role that they play in financial inclusion, and also the important role that they play in supporting the MSMEs by lending them. So these are all the 5 important issues which are associated with the banking system. So these were the other articles that were not important from exam point of view. So today's prelims related current affairs question is, recently the Jaya Jaitley task force was in news, and for what purpose was this task force set up? Was it for tribal health, maternal issues, low female labor force participation, or is it elderly care? So do write in the comment section. That's it for today. Thank you.